Good evening, everyone. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. Tonight, as we ease into another calm journey together, I want to invite you into a mystery that began on an ordinary spring day in 2001, a day that should have passed without any remarkable events, a day filled with small tasks, sunlight, and routine. Yet from that moment forward, an entire community would be left with questions that have lingered for more than 2 decades. This is the story of Branson Perry, a young man from the small town of Skidmore, Missouri. On April 11th, 2001, he was simply going about his day, tidying up his home, preparing for his father's return from the hospital, and taking care of the kinds of chores most of us would barely remember by the end of the week. It was an ordinary day by every measure, until it quietly became the last time anyone saw him. There was no dramatic alarm, no immediate sense that something was wrong. Branson was at home, cleaning rooms, moving things where they needed to be, and following the gentle rhythm of a typical morning. A friend stopped by briefly, chatted with him, and left. The house was peaceful. Nothing felt unusual. And then, like a scene that fades in the middle of a sentence, Branson stepped outside to return a pair of jumper cables to the shed and never came back inside. It is a moment that feels almost too simple to be real. One step out the door, a short walk across the yard, and then silence. New commotion, new dramatic clues, new gathering storm. Just an unfinished day, frozen in time. Inside the house, small traces of the morning remain, tasks left half done. Small details suggesting that Branson fully expected to return in just a minute or two. But minute by minute, that small gap stretched into hours, then days, then years. What makes this case especially haunting is not only the suddenness of the disappearance, but how normal everything seemed just before it happened. There was no hint of a major conflict, no urgent phone calls, no clear sign that Branson planned to go anywhere. And yet, the moment he walked into the yard, the story shifted into a mystery that has never been fully explained. Tonight, we are going to walk gently through the facts of the day, explore the strange fragments that were left behind, and reflect on how a life can slip between the lines of a routine morning. This is not a story of fear. It is a story of unanswered questions, of a quiet town holding on to hope, and of a young man whose absence still echoes softly more than 20 years later. So, settle in, take a slow breath, and let us begin. If we rewind to the morning of Branson's disappearance, what stands out most is how simple and familiar everything was. Branson was not heading out for a long trip. He was not preparing for anything unusual. He was just cleaning the sort of everyday routine that does not attract attention and usually does not hide any secrets. But in this case, those quiet chores became the last known moments of his life before he stepped into the unknown. Inside the house, Branson had been moving from room to room, making small improvements, putting things back where they belonged. His father was due to come home soon after being away in the hospital, and Branson wanted the place to look better for him. There is something gentle, almost touching, about that detail. A young man, in his early 20s, taking responsibility for the little things, wanting home to feel right for someone he cared about. As he worked, the house reflected the rhythm of an ordinary morning. Items were being sorted out, laundry was in progress, and various belongings lay in places that suggested he planned to return to them later. It looked like a day in motion, a day that was not supposed to stop abruptly. Every unfinished task is now a quiet reminder of a story paused mid-chapter. A friend stopped by for a short visit, just long enough to exchange a few words, check in, and leave again. Nothing strange was reported. No tension, No sign of urgency. Just two people connecting briefly on a regular day. After the friend left, Branson continued pacing through the house, finishing up the last round of cleaning. And then came that moment, the decision to grab a pair of jumper cables and bring them back out to the shed behind the house. It was a simple task that should have taken less than a minute. A quick walk, a small action, and then back inside to continue his chores. But instead of returning, that tiny task became the point where the trail suddenly ended. When you picture the house that morning, it feels almost frozen, rooms half tidy, signs of life scattered gently across the space. The kind of scene you might walk through while expecting someone to come back at any moment. Except no one did. Those small pieces of routine became part of the mystery, because they reveal something important. Branson did not appear to be planning a sudden departure. Everything he was doing suggests a person who expected to be right back. And that is what makes this case quietly heartbreaking. It was not chaos or conflict or warning signs that marked the last hours he was seen. It was normalcy. It was responsibility. It was a young man doing the kinds of things we all do without thinking twice. Yet somewhere between the house and the shed, that ordinary morning shifted into a story that still carries unanswered questions today. One of the final confirmed moments in Branson Perry's day is surprisingly ordinary. A short visit from a friend, followed by a simple task outside. It is a sequence of events that feels small, almost too small to carry any meaning, yet it has become one of the anchors investigators return to again and again. The friend who stopped by did not stay long. It was the kind of casual visit that happens all the time, especially in small towns where people drift in and out of each other's lives naturally. Their conversation was not described as tense or unusual. In fact, everything about that interaction reinforces the idea that Branson was in a stable, familiar headspace. There was no hint of distress, no visible sign that anything was wrong or that he planned to go anywhere. Moments after that brief visit ended, Branson moved on to another tiny task around the house. He picked up a pair of jumper cables, the kind you might use to help start a car with a weak battery. Someone had borrowed them earlier, and now he wanted to return them to the shed behind the house. It is a chore so forgettable that most of us would not even think twice about it. Yet in this story, that small journey, a walk that should have lasted maybe 20 or 30 seconds, became the last known action he ever took. Witnesses and investigators later pieced together that Branson walked out of the back door, crossed the yard, and headed toward the shed. The weather was mild. The neighborhood was calm. There was nothing in the air to signal danger or disruption. It was the kind of environment where you would expect someone to walk outside and be back before the front door even had time to swing shut. But Branson did not return. The house remained quiet. Minutes passed, then more. There was no sound of footsteps, no call for help, no conversation, no car starting or leaving the driveway. It was as if the morning simply absorbed him. For the friend who had just visited, and later for the family who came home, that absence felt unreal. A disappearance that happened in the middle of a task so mundane, it feels almost fragile. It is this exact detail that has puzzled so many people over the years. If someone intended to leave voluntarily, would they go in the middle of cleaning? Right after a casual visit? Carrying nothing with them? If someone intended to disappear, why would they first take the time to return a set of jumper cables? These questions form the quiet logic that keeps pointing back to the same unsettling possibility that whatever happened to Branson occurred suddenly, unexpectedly, and without giving him any chance to prepare. That fleeting moment, the walk from the doorway to the shed, represents the last point where the story still feels anchored in normal life. After that, everything dissolves into uncertainty. What makes Branson Perry's case so quietly haunting is not just that he stepped outside and vanished. It is the complete stillness that followed. No one saw him walk away. No one heard a car pull up. No neighbors reported anything out of the ordinary. It was as if time continued moving, but Branson simply did not return with it. When investigators later reconstructed the timeline, they were struck by how sharply the trail ends. One moment, Branson was inside the house, in the middle of chores, moving from room to room. The next moment, he was walking into the backyard with a pair of jumper cables in his hand. And after that, nothing. The back door stayed open. The shed remained quiet. No voices were heard. No signs of struggle were found. The ordinary sounds of a rural Missouri morning continued on, completely unchanged. For a disappearance to happen within such a small window and in such a familiar open space feels almost impossible. The yard was not surrounded by dense woods. The neighbors were not far away. The street was not busy, but it was not isolated either. This was not the middle of the night or a remote wilderness. It was broad daylight, in a neighborhood where people tended to notice things. Yet somehow, whatever happened to Branson took place, without leaving behind a moment that anyone could point to later. When his family members arrived home, they expected to find him finishing up the chores or resting after a long morning. Instead, they walked into a house that felt paused mid-sentence. Lights were on. Tasks were half completed. Music equipment was out. The kind of scene that tells you a person meant to return in just a minute. But the minutes kept passing, and the house remained unchanged, as if waiting for someone who was only running late. At first, there was no immediate panic. People assumed he had stepped out for a short errand or gone to visit a neighbor. In small towns, it is easy to explain away a brief absence. But as hours turned into an entire day with no word, that quiet uncertainty deepened into something heavier. Friends and family looked around the property, calling his name, checking nearby roads. But everywhere they looked, the answer was the same: no trace. What makes this detail especially powerful is the contrast between how ordinary the moment was and how completely it dissolved into mystery. Usually, when someone disappears, there are sounds, movements, witnesses, or at least a clue left behind. But here, the silence itself became the clue. Branson walked into a space he knew well, under conditions that should have been completely safe, and yet he did not come back. That gap, that quiet interval between stepping out the back door and being gone, is the heart of the mystery. It is a moment so small and so simple, yet it opened into 2 decades of unanswered questions. One of the quietest yet most revealing parts of this story lies not outside the house, but inside it. When friends and family walked through the rooms after Branson's disappearance, they noticed something that did not feel dramatic at first, but became more unsettling the longer they looked. The house felt paused, as if someone had stepped away for just a moment and fully intended to return. There were chores started but not completed, objects left in places that suggested a mind mid-flow, and small signs that Branson had been moving with purpose before he suddenly vanished. A pair of gloves on the counter, cleaning supplies still out, items halfway sorted into keep and put away, laundry that seemed to be in various stages, not yet folded or finished. Nothing about the scene matched the behavior of someone preparing for a sudden departure. Instead, everything pointed to a young man who expected to be back inside in a minute or two. It is a detail that seems small, but investigators often look closely at the ordinary things, the quiet pieces of someone's daily routine. Branson's unfinished tasks were like footprints in time, hinting at what his mindset must have been. He was not packing. He was not organizing belongings, as if preparing to leave. He was not writing notes or gathering travel items. He was simply cleaning, putting in the kind of steady, calm effort you would expect from someone getting the house ready for a parent's return. These subtle details tell a story without words. They suggest that whatever happened was not planned. It did not follow a long internal decision. It did not involve preparation or even hesitation. It was interruption, sudden, complete, and silent. Even the arrangement of certain objects added to the mystery. Some items were placed in spots that made sense only in the middle of a task. A kitchen chair slightly pulled back, papers gathered into a stack, but not sorted. A toolbox open with pieces still inside. It was the kind of environment where someone might say, "I will be right back, step outside for a quick job, and expect to return in just a breath or two." But Branson did not return, and the house remained exactly as he left it. For his loved ones, those unfinished tasks became emotional markers, small reminders of a normal day, suddenly frozen in place. Every time someone walked through the rooms, those details whispered the same message. Whatever happened to him was not something he prepared for. The contrast is what makes this detail so gently heartbreaking. A young man doing simple, thoughtful chores, unaware that those everyday actions would become the last trace of his presence. A home filled with signs of life, yet left in a stillness no one expected. These fragments of routine, mundane, almost invisible on any other day, now serve as the quiet backdrop to one of Missouri's most enduring mysteries. Among all the details in Branson Perry's Disappearance, there is one that stands out like a soft echo, something small, almost too small, and yet deeply unsettling once you look closer. A few days after Branson vanished, the pair of jumper cables he carried out to the shed were suddenly found back in their place. No one in the family had returned them. No neighbor admitted to touching them. Yet there they were, sitting exactly where they should have been all along. This moment has lingered in the case for more than 20 years. Not because the jumper cables themselves hold some dramatic secret, but because of what their return represents. Branson walked out of the house carrying them, intending to put them away. That was the last confirmed action he took. When he failed to return, his disappearance became the central focus, but the cables being placed back in the shed days later created a quiet, eerie wrinkle in the timeline. Investigators noted that the shed did not show signs of forced entry. Nothing was scattered, nothing broken, nothing out of place, except the fact that the cables had somehow moved while no one was watching. The question is simple, yet profoundly difficult. Who brought them back? If Branson had returned on his own, even briefly, someone would likely have seen him or heard movement on the property. But no such sighting exists. And if another person returned the cables, the mystery deepens. Why would someone who might have been involved choose to perform such an ordinary, almost domestic action? Why would they step onto the property, open the shed, put an object back exactly where it belonged, and leave without being noticed? The image is haunting in its simplicity. Someone quietly approaching the shed in broad daylight or under cover of night, placing the jumper cables inside and slipping away again. The act itself seems almost symbolic, like a puzzle piece dropped back onto the table, but without any explanation for how it fits. Some people have suggested that the cables may never have left the shed in the first place, that perhaps they had been overlooked during the initial search. But those close to the case consistently insist that the shed was checked. Others have wondered whether someone familiar with the home might have walked by, seen the cables outside, and decided to put them away without realizing the importance of their action. Yet no one has ever come forward to verify that. The quiet return of those cables carries a weight that feels disproportionate to their size. They mark the only tangible movement of an object in the entire case, the only physical clue that something, or someone, revisited the property after Branson vanished. It is a tiny detail with enormous implications because it suggests that the timeline did not end the moment he walked into the yard. Instead, something continued happening after that moment. Something the house could not speak of, but the jumper cables quietly tried to. In the days that followed Branson Perry's disappearance, the quiet town of Skidmore shifted from routine calm to a slow-growing sense that something was truly wrong. Friends, neighbors, and investigators walked the same paths Branson had taken, checked the same rooms he had been in, and traced the same short distance between the back door and the shed. Yet the most striking discovery was that there was almost nothing to discover at all. Search teams combed through the house, first carefully, methodically, room by room. They expected to find at least one clue: a footprint, a dropped item, a sign of hurried movement, anything that might indicate where Branson went or what interrupted him. Instead, they found a scene frozen in place, exactly as it had been left that morning. No overturned furniture, no signs of forced entry, no marks or disturbances. Just the quiet aftermath of a day that never finished. Outside, the yard was equally unremarkable. The grass around the shed looked undisturbed. The ground did not show unusual tracks or marks. The shed door was not damaged or forced. It was as though Branson had walked into the yard, taken a few steps, and then simply stepped out of the world without leaving any physical trace behind. The community joined the search too, spreading out into fields, along roadsides, and through the small wooded patches near the neighborhood. Volunteers formed lines, calling his name gently into the spring air. But every shout faded into silence. And every path they checked ended the same way, with no sign of where he had gone. One of the most challenging parts of this case is how little the physical environment offers. In many disappearances, investigators at least have objects, footprints, or personal items to create a timeline. Here, the lack of evidence becomes its own kind of clue. Something happened to Branson, but whatever it was, left no physical footprint, no trace on the property, and no indication that he had walked or been taken across a particular route. Even the roads around the house yielded nothing. No car tracks that seemed unusual. No reports of unfamiliar vehicles. No neighbor recalling a strange noise. Skidmore is the kind of place where people notice things. A car that does not belong. A visitor who seems out of place. Yet on that day, nothing stood out. The absence of evidence forces us to imagine the disappearance not as a dramatic event, but as something deeply quiet, an interruption so clean and sudden that it left the world around it completely unchanged. That silence became the heaviest part of the investigation. Without physical clues, every explanation becomes a possibility, and every possibility remains unanswered. What makes this detail so haunting is not the lack of answers, but the stillness itself. A young man walked into the yard of the home he knew well, and the earth gave back no hint of where he went next. As investigators searched for any explanation behind Branson Perry's disappearance, attention eventually turned toward a man named Jack Wayne Rogers, someone whose life would soon intersect with the case in a way that raised many questions but provided almost no answers. Rogers was arrested months after Branson vanished, but for reasons completely unrelated to the missing person investigation. When authorities searched his belongings during that separate case, they uncovered writings and statements that were unsettling enough for police to look deeper. Some of his comments seemed to describe harming a young man in a way that echoed certain details of Branson's disappearance. On the surface, this connection seemed significant. Here was a man with troubling behavior, living in the same region, who had made claims that could, in theory, fit into the timeline. Investigators had to ask, was he describing Branson? Was he involved? Or were his statements unrelated imagination, exaggeration, or something else entirely? In cases like this, even the smallest overlap can send investigators down a long corridor of possibilities. When authorities questioned Rogers, he insisted he had nothing to do with Branson's disappearance. Despite the alarming nature of his statements, nothing in the evidence they collected could directly tie him to the house, to the shed, or to any location Branson may have gone. There were no witnesses placing them together, no physical signs connecting Rogers to the property, and none of the written claims provided details that only someone involved would know. Investigators described Rogers as someone who often exaggerated or fabricated stories, making it difficult to know where truth ended and imagination began. His statements stirred public concern, but concerns alone were not enough to build a case. Over time, his involvement faded from the center of the investigation, and authorities eventually concluded that while he was a troubling figure, there was no verifiable proof linking him to Branson. And that is where this piece of the story remains today, a cloud that drifted near the case but never fully connected. For many in the community, Rogers became a symbol of how unsettling coincidences can be in a small town, especially when someone disappears without explanation. But he also became a reminder of how important it is to rely on evidence, not just suspicion. The Rogers angle left investigators with a familiar, frustrating place, back at the beginning, with no clear direction. His claims created ripples in the case, but like ripples on a quiet pond, they eventually faded without revealing what lay beneath. What remains is a sense of how fragile the truth can be in a mystery like this, how easily a person with unrelated troubles can appear connected, and how necessary it is to separate the loud distractions from the quiet reality. And the quiet reality in Branson's case is this: despite the attention Rogers received, nothing discovered about him brought investigators any closer to understanding what truly happened on that ordinary spring morning. As the days passed without any sign of Branson, investigators widened their circle, reaching out to anyone who might have seen him, spoken with him, or crossed paths with him in the hours leading up to his disappearance. In a small town like Skidmore, people tend to know one another well, and information often spreads quickly. But in this case, what spread was not clarity, it was confusion. Officers talked with neighbors, friends, acquaintances, and anyone who had been near the Perry home around the time Branson vanished. At first, it seemed like the most natural next step. Gather observations, compare memories, and create a timeline. But almost immediately, the investigation ran into a challenge that still shadows the case today. The accounts did not line up neatly. Some people recalled seeing Branson earlier than others claimed. Some thought they heard noises outside, while others insisted the morning had been completely still. A few mentioned noticing cars in the area, but the descriptions did not match. And several people, when asked about Branson's behavior before he disappeared, gave answers that contradicted one another in subtle ways. None of these inconsistencies were dramatic on their own, but combined, they created a blurred picture instead of a clear one. It became difficult for investigators to know which details were accurate, which were misremembered, and which were influenced by the stress and speculation surrounding the case. In a small town where conversations travel quickly, even innocent misunderstandings can snowball into stories that do not perfectly reflect reality. The friend who visited Branson that morning offered one version of events. Others, who said they would been nearby, offered different impressions. And still others, relying on second-hand information, passed along stories that could not be fully verified. With each interview, the puzzle seemed to gain more pieces, but the pieces did not fit together cleanly. These contradictions slowed the investigation and forced officers to recheck timelines, revisit earlier statements, and gently untangle the threads of truth from the knots of rumor. They had to ask, who saw what? Who misremembered? Who filled in the gaps with assumptions? and who might have withheld small but important details, either out of confusion or simply wanting to avoid being involved. In the end, investigators were left with a tapestry of information that felt soft around the edges, impressions instead of certainties, fragments instead of a full picture. This lack of consistency did not point to any clear suspect or scenario. Instead, it created a space where almost anything seemed possible, and where every theory had to be held lightly because so little could be confirmed with confidence. For a family waiting for answers, contradictions like these are some of the most difficult obstacles. They do not provide direction. They do not close doors. They simply make the path forward harder to see. And in Branson's case, those blurred details contributed to a quiet stalemate, a moment where investigators had many voices, but no solid lead, many stories, but no clear truth. One of the most challenging parts of Branson Perry's story is the silence that followed his final known moments. After he stepped into the yard that April morning, there were no confirmed sightings, no reliable reports, and no solid clues that placed him anywhere beyond the property. It is as though the trail simply dissolved the moment he walked outside. In many missing person cases, there is at least a faint thread that investigators can follow: a sighting at a gas station, a security camera capturing a figure in the distance, a witness who remembers a detail that stands out. But with Branson, none of that surfaced. Every potential lead that emerged in the days and months afterward eventually faded under scrutiny. Some people thought they saw someone who looked like him. Others remembered someone walking along a road, but when these sightings were checked, none of them held up as true or verifiable. This lack of confirmed sightings creates a unique kind of emptiness in the investigation. Without a single point on the map beyond the house, there is no direction to look toward, no sense of where he might have gone, willingly or unwillingly. It leaves investigators standing at the back door, metaphorically speaking, staring into a space that offers no answers. What makes this absence even more striking is the setting. Skidmore is not a large city where a person can disappear into crowds or blend into busy streets. It is a small rural community with open spaces, quiet roads, and neighbors who tend to notice unusual things. In a place like that, someone walking alone, someone hitching a ride, or someone getting into a vehicle would almost certainly be remembered. But no such memory survived the investigation, not with enough clarity to be useful. Every time a new report surfaced a possible sighting in another town, a vague memory from someone passing through, investigators traced it, hoping for even a glimmer of truth. But each time, the answer was the same. It was not him. These repeated dead ends gradually painted a picture of a disappearance that left no footprint at all. The silence became its own kind of evidence. If Branson had wandered off, someone likely would have seen him. If he had chosen to leave on his own, signs of preparation might have appeared. If he had encountered someone on the property, there might have been traces of movement or noise. But instead, the world around him remained completely unchanged, as though the moment simply swallowed the next chapters of his story. For his family, that silence was the hardest part. With no confirmed sightings and no sense of direction, every possibility felt both too far and too close at the same time. Without a sighting to anchor their hopes or fears, they were left drifting between maybe he is somewhere out there and maybe something happened right here. In a mystery like this, sometimes the loudest clue is the quiet that surrounds it. And in Branson Perry's case, that quiet has stretched across more than 2 decades, a reminder of how a person can slip from view even on the most ordinary of mornings. As the months turned into years and no new information surfaced, the investigation into Branson Perry's disappearance quietly shifted into a different phase, the heavy, suspended state, known as a cold case. It was not a decision marked by a dramatic announcement or a sudden change in momentum. Instead, it was more like watching a river slow down over time, until the water barely seemed to move at all. For a long while, investigators continued revisiting leads, rechecking old statements, and comparing the case with new information from nearby regions. Every small detail was reviewed more than once. Every rumor was explored. Every potential sighting was checked. But none of these efforts brought the story any closer to clarity. The mystery remained stubbornly still. Cold cases often exist in a quiet space between hope and resignation, not closed, not forgotten, but no longer active in the way they used to be. Branson's case settled into that space gradually. The search team stopped gathering. The neighborhood went back to its usual routines. The media stories slowed, eventually fading, until only anniversary articles or community reminders brought his name back into public conversation. But for those who cared about him, the passage of time did not soften the weight of not knowing. Branson's family kept hoping for a phone call, a tip, a moment when someone remembered something that had been forgotten. They lived with questions that never lost their sharpness. Where did he go? What happened in those seconds between the back door and the shed? Was there something small everyone missed? Why was the world silent? For investigators, cold cases are never truly closed. They live in filing cabinets, in digital archives, and in the minds of the officers who worked on them. From time to time, a new detective reviews the file with fresh eyes, hoping a small overlooked detail might now stand out. Sometimes advances in technology provide new tools for re-examining evidence. But in Branson's case, the absence of physical evidence means there is very little for modern tools to analyze. And so the case remains suspended, not solved, not abandoned, simply waiting. There is something deeply human about the way cold cases linger. They reflect our desire for answers, for closure, for stories to have endings. But Branson's story, at least publicly, remains open-ended. Even after more than 20 years, there has been no confirmed development, no major lead that changed the direction of the investigation, and no discovery that brings his family closer to understanding what happened. Yet the fact that the case is cold does not mean it is forgotten. His name still appears on missing persons databases. Officers still encourage people with information to come forward, and every so often, someone new hears his story for the first time and wonders if somewhere, somehow, the missing piece still exists. A cold case is not the end of a story. It is a pause, a long, quiet pause, waiting for the day when even the smallest detail might thaw the silence. Even after more than 2 decades, Branson Perry's case is not considered closed. It sits in that quiet, watchful space where investigators remain open to new information, hoping that one day, a small detail, even a sentence remembered, a location revisited, or a passing comment overheard might finally bring light to what happened on that ordinary morning in April 2001. Law enforcement agencies in Missouri continue to keep his file active. That means they still welcome tips, review submissions, and respond whenever someone believes they have noticed something significant. Even if the calls are rare now, each one is treated with the same seriousness, because in a case like this, the missing piece could come from anywhere, at any time. From time to time, people still reach out with memories or thoughts that have resurfaced unexpectedly. Someone might remember seeing a certain car in the area. Someone else might revisit an old conversation that did not seem important at the time. Others simply want to share information that feels relevant, hoping it might connect to something in the case file. Investigators know most of these leads won't result in breakthroughs, but they also know that the one that matters could arrive when no one expects it. Modern technology occasionally offers new avenues too. Advances in data analysis, communication tracing, and digital records sometimes allow old cases to be examined in new ways. But Branson's disappearance has a unique challenge. The lack of physical evidence and the absence of verifiable sightings leave little material for technology to re-examine. Even so, investigators periodically revisit the case with fresh perspectives in case something stands out now that did not before. For the community, the case lives on in memory. Small towns do not forget their unanswered stories. Branson's face still appears in missing persons databases, on anniversary posts, and sometimes on online forums where strangers discuss mysteries that have yet to be solved. People who never met him still think about him, still talk about him, and still hope that one day the silence will break. For his family, the open status of the case means hope and heartbreak. Walk together, hope, because the door is not shut, because answers are still possible. Heartbreak, because every passing year still carries the same uncertainty, the same missing voice, the same empty space where clarity should be. The fact that the case remains open is a reminder that even after decades, investigators have not given up. No major developments have been made public, but that does not mean the story is finished. Cold cases have been solved after 30, 40, even 50 years, sometimes by coincidence, sometimes by confession, sometimes by the quiet persistence of people who refuse to forget. And for now, that is where Branson's story rests. Not lost, not erased, but waiting. Waiting for the right memory to surface. Waiting for the right person to speak. Waiting for the moment when even the softest whisper of truth is enough to change everything. As we come to the end of tonight's quiet journey, we are left with a story that does not offer sharp answers or dramatic revelations, only the soft, lingering silence of a life interrupted. Branson Perry's disappearance is one of those mysteries that sits gently on the edge of our thoughts, not because of grand twists or sensational moments, but because of how ordinary the day was when everything changed. A young man cleaning his home, a quick visit from a friend, a walk across the yard with a pair of jumper cables. These tiny moments, too simple to notice on any other day, became the last glimpses of a life that slipped out of sight without leaving a trail behind. And maybe that is why this story touches so many people, because it reminds us that uncertainty does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes quietly, unfolding in the space between one normal task and the next. For more than 20 years, this case has rested in a gentle kind of stillness. No major breakthroughs, no clear direction, no final explanation, just a community holding on to hope and a family carrying questions that time has not softened. Yet even in that silence, there is something deeply human. The persistence of memory, the openness of investigators who still welcome new information, and the simple act of keeping Branson's name alive in conversations like this one. And maybe that is the heart of it. Stories like Branson's remind us that every person, every routine morning, every quiet moment matters. That the world is full of lives unfolding in small, delicate ways, and that when one of those lives vanishes, the absence echoes through everyone who remembers. So as we close this chapter tonight, let the story settle softly, not as something frightening, but as a reminder of how precious the ordinary can be. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders loosen, and let the quiet return to your space, the way it returns to the little town of Skidmore after another day of unanswered questions. Thank you for spending this gentle moment with me. Sleep well, take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next calm story.